So now I will invite Zlatina Bogdanova to present on the communism in memory studies, the Bulgarian perspective. And Zlatina is also from the Institute of Ethnology and Folklore Studies at the Bulgarian Academy of Sciences. She holds PhD from the Martin Luther Universität Halle-Wittenberg for a thesis on studying the processes of exclusion and inclusion in rural Bulgaria, the significance of kinship and social networks. She was also a research fellow at the Max Planck Institute for Social Anthropology and at the Regional Archaeological Museum in Plovdiv.
Thank you. This presentation will address certain aspects of the memory studies on Bulgarian communism. I will attempt to present a brief review of some of the major themes and authors who published their works after 1989. The list of selected publications is by no means exhaustive of the research on the communist past done in Bulgaria. It is my preference to limit my focus to studies and initiatives deconstructing the monolithic picture of communism by presenting the micro-narratives of different communities in the Bulgarian society. The publications produced so far have emphasized themes and perspectives revealing the different phases of the communist regime. Two leading institutions occupy a special place in the Bulgarian academic environment with regard to their advanced research on the memory of the communist past: the Sofia University and the Institute for the Study of the Recent Past, created in 2005. These two academic centers have concentrated on compiling archives of oral histories revealing various aspects of the socialist lifestyles. The Center for Advanced Study in Sofia and the Institute of Ethnology and Folklore Studies with Ethnographic Museum at the Bulgarian Academy of Sciences have also made notable contributions to this topic. In the Department of History and Theory of Culture at the Faculty of Philosophy at the Sofia University, the researchers Daniela Koleva, Raina Gavrilova, Vanya Lenkova have edited 2 volumes with live stories: The Sunset Again Against Me, Live Stories, and On the Square at the 2 Fountains, Live Stories from the Village of Iskar. In 2002, I also took part in a field work research whose main focus was on collecting autobiographical narratives for a project on oral history and gender roles initiated by the Bulgarian Group for Research on Women's and Gender History and the Bulgarian Association of University Women. I was then a student in the Master's Program in Cultural Anthropology of Southeastern Europe at the Sofia University, and together with other students from the program, I conducted interviews in the Bulgarian town of Todor Veltchev. In the course of 1 week, we interviewed women, mostly retired teachers, according to a list with questions examining their evaluations of gender roles, family relations, and statuses. We also discussed issues related to the feminist outlook in Bulgaria. The produced biographical narratives were published under the title Voices of Their Own: Oral History Interviews of Women. The themes of gender roles and identities were explored in relation to formal employment of women in tourism industry in Bulgaria before and after 1989 by Anna Luleva, a senior researcher from the Institute of Ethnology and Folklore Studies. Her paper, Informality, Gender, Tourism, The Case of Borovets Resort, was published in the journal Bulgarian Ethnology. It traces the continuity in informal work practices under the 2 different ideological regimes. Anna Luleva has made notable contributions to gender and women's studies in Bulgaria, a research field largely underdeveloped in the Bulgarian Academy. The biographical method is mostly used in a number of memory studies on individual and collective experiences of Bulgarian communism. The Institute for the Study of the Recent Past issued 2 collections of biographical narratives in the series Past Imperfect. The first book of the series, edited by Daniela Koleva, appeared in 2007. It is called Lighting Does Not Struck Bushes: The Communism, Life, Destinies. In addition, the Institute has compiled large archives containing interviews with people who share their memories as a result of the contest, periodically announced, addressed to the general public to send them life stories or personal diaries reflecting their experiences of socialism. So far, 2 volumes have been compiled by Ivailo Znepolsky. He's the director of the Institute. Under the title, This is My Past, Recollections, Diaries, Witnesses. The collection of autobiographical stories demonstrated the existence of 2 types of memories of the communist past, nostalgic and traumatic memories. The nostalgic memories have been greatly explained to be the outcome of the current crisis and the reaction to the difficult post-socialist transition. Traumatic memories are recorded among people who had been repressed in one way or another by the totalitarian regime. These are the Bulgarian intellectuals, the dissidents of the regime, prisoners in labor camps, victims of the secret police. Their biographical narratives oppose the positive evaluation of communism expressed by the first group. There is no definite consensus in the Bulgarian society on how the past should be addressed, interpreted, and presented in the textbooks. The contest over memory and the debate who owns the past continues to this day. The interest in researching the past and addressing the complex and oftentimes painful memories has been demonstrated in a number of initiatives. In 2011, the Roundtable Bulgarian Communism 2 decades later was organized by a number of influential academic and civil centers in Bulgaria. This scientific forum was dedicated to the status of the research done on the communist period and the public reactions on this period 2 decades later. The papers were published 2 years later in the collection Bulgarian Communism, Debates and Interpretations. In the next sections of this presentation, I will review in greater detail some aspects of the daily life, ideology and practice under communism, examined by Bulgarian researchers. I will more closely look at the relationship between memory and identity, emphasized in the research done on different groups within the Bulgarian society. Therefore, I will present a selection of books and papers addressing this perspective of the memory studies on Bulgarian communism. First, the relationship between identity and memory is explored with regard to members of ethnic and confessional communities negatively affected by the communist regime. Evgenia Troeva and Elena Petkova from the Institute of Ethnology and Folklore Studies explore the lifestyles and religious practices of the Bulgarian Muslims in the Rhodopis, a group that had been notoriously repressed by the communist regime during the so-called Rebirth campaign. The papers were published in the collection book, The Bulgarian 20th Century, Collective Memory and National Identity, edited by Anna Luleva. This publication gives a decent overview of the current state of memory studies in Bulgaria by placing a special emphasis on the formation of collective identities. In the book, the researchers focus on marginalized groups within the Bulgarian societies. Thus, for example, the recollections of former prisoners in labor camps are recorded and interpreted by Peter Petrov from the Institute of Ethnology and Folklore Studies. In his text, Trauma as a formative collective memory is present in the narratives of the camp inmates during socialism. Petrov distinguishes 2 main narrative strategies, self-victimization and self-heroization, used by the respondents. Another collection of life stories edited by Daniela Koleva, published under the title Belene, a Site of Memory Anthropological Survey. It was produced in 2010 as a result of a project initiated by the Institute of the Study of the Recent Past. This project was called Policies of Memory and Knowledge, the Recent Past and its Contemporary Uses in Bulgaria. The biographical narratives collected in this book paint the contemporary picture of Belene, a small town in North Bulgaria, notoriously known for the largest concentration camp operating during the communist regime that was established on the nearby island of Persin on the Danube River in 1949. The town and its residents were presented as places of memory, often disputed and rejected, silenced and repressed during the socialist years. Notable places of memory throughout Bulgaria, including monuments, commemorative ceremonies, and rituals of remembrance, are addressed by Valentina Sharlanova, Katelina Saltirova-Pavlova, and Valentina Vaseva, who published their contributions in the mentioned collections, The Bulgarian 20th Century, Collective Memory and National Identity. Other distinguished contributions in the same book focus on the conflict between the communist ideology and the Orthodox religion, the traditional faith of Bulgarians. In her study, Georgeta Nazarska explores personal religiosity, attitudes towards orthodoxy, and the atheistic policies of the state socialism. The opposition between the official ideology and the right to individual choice is analyzed in the context of a field study conducted in the period 2009-2010. The respondents were born in the 60s, 50s, and 40s of the last century. Another researcher, Marianka Borisova, analyzes the personal memories of a female resident of Chepelare who, in her own biography, was able to combine and reconcile two mutually exclusive identities. She was a committed Christian believer, and at the same time she was socially active as a party functionary. Momchil Metodiev has studied in detail the atheistic policies of the totalitarian state. In 2010, he published his research in the mentioned series Past Imperfect, initiated by the Institute of the Study of the Recent Past. His book, Between Faith and Compromise, The Orthodox Church and the Communist State in Bulgaria, presents a documental research on the mechanisms through which the communist state strove to eliminate the influence of the church in society. Metodiev provides evidence of the methods by which the church as a public institution was targeted by the authorities, who sought to marginalize it by destroying its integrity and creating public distrust towards the priesthood by compromising its reputation. Another notable perspective towards the issues of religious freedoms, individual spirituality, collective identities and the communist past originated from the representatives of the Bulgarian Protestants. Recently, their churches have been growing in numbers after a period of severe repressions. The Protestant religious communities were not absolutely destroyed despite the notable attempt of the communist state to persecute and put to trial some of the pastors. In the last couple of years, I have been following the initiatives and public events organized by Harta, a civil association of Bulgarian evangelical Christians. The president of Harta, Todor Veltchev, has recently taken part in a conference commemorating the occupation of Bulgaria by the Soviet army and the impositions of the communist regime 70 years ago. At this conference, Todor Veltchev spoke about the heavy spiritual legacy of communism. Here I will use a quote from his speech. I will read only a portion of this quote. In this year, the month of September reminds us of the heavy legacy of the present-day Bulgaria. 70 years ago, on September 9, 1944, it was declared, figuratively speaking, by the communist scope, by the rule of the brute force, the bayonets of the occupying Soviet army. In the years that followed, it had been set forth and sealed with the blood of tens of thousands of decent, capable and honest Bulgarians, whose fault was that they did not profess the communist belief, they did not accept its prophecies for a bright future, or simply because they were just decent, capable and honest. Finally, the legacy of September 9 was generously safeguarded for the future generations by making the headless Bulgarian people a prisoner in their own country, deprived of the freedom to undertake and create, as well as of the opportunity to travel and enjoy the heritage of other nations. In the stuff incubator of the real socialism, amazingly correct concept, the nation had to be re-educated to forget everything that has been learned from its previous Christian heritage. Most recently, Hart organized a series of public lectures during the Night of Museums and Galleries, a public event held annually in Plovdiv. The cycle of 3 lectures was presented under the heading Christian History and Public Values in the Archaeological Museum of Plovdiv on September 12, 2014. The first 2 speakers, Adriana Ljubenova and Dimo Češmadžija from the Plovdiv University, addressed the early Christian history of Plovdiv. In the last lecture, The communist Golgotha of the church, Ventsislav Kalachev from the Sofia University, spoke about the measures taken by the totalitarian authorities to silence and control the Bulgarian Orthodox Church and discourage Christian believers in Bulgaria as part of the general process of eliminating the Bulgarian intellectual elite and replacing it with people loyal to the Communist Party. Thus, his basic argument about the decapitation and depersonalizations of the Bulgarian nation bears close resemblance to the ideas expressed by Todor Veltchev in the quotation given above. Generally, this event created by Harty indicates the growing interest in rediscovering the forgotten and silenced Christian heritage of the Bulgarian nation. The theme of replacing the pre-socialist elites with elites loyal to the Communist Party and ideology is developed by Pepka Boadjieva in her book Social Engineering, Admission Policies in Higher Education During the Communist Regime in Bulgaria. Other aspects of the social engineering during socialism were reflected in the efforts of suppressing individual lifestyles, choices and consumer-based identities. At the same time, the official ideology dictated what the basic necessities were and how they should be satisfied. The result was the establishment of a specific socialist consumption culture and associated lifestyles whose aspects have not been thoroughly examined in the researches in Bulgaria. In the inventory book of socialism, the compilers Yana Genova and Georgi Gospodinov present a selection of images of once popular consumer items, pieces of furniture, food products, and household appliances typical for the socialist period. In the foreword of this photo gallery, the authors describe how this specific culture originated and what the general ideas behind its establishment and perpetuation were. In 1962, at its 8th Congress, the Bulgarian Communist Party raised the slogan for the new socialist man, who is characterized by elevated spiritual and material needs, and outlined a program for the development of the light industry aimed at the end consumer. The Central Party decision to increase the consumption of goods and services paradoxically coupled with the socialist economy of the state-regulated deficit. The new program focused on the visual, packaging, graphic design, advertising, interior design, but failed to produce a consumer with a free choice. Because this was economy without competition, without choice, endless rows of the same type of cans filled the long shelves of newly built supermarkets. Hence, the vision was not so much intended to design seductive objects of the purchasing desire, but retained its rather educational function. In 2004, Georgi Gospodinov, with a few close associates, initiated an internet portal, Spomenite ni, translated as Our Memories, and invited people to publish their personal memories of the socialist years, starting from the early 1950s to the end of the 1980s. The project was motivated by the desire to disclose and lift the veil of a past silenced, unspoken, misinterpreted, and increasingly distant from the present and future generations of Bulgarians. In the course of 2 years, between 2004 and 2006, 450 stories were collected and a selection of 171 of them was published in the book I Lived Socialism. Here I present one of the stories from this compilation that was published on the website Spomenite ni in English, and this story also appeared in the book in its original Bulgarian version. The story reveals the daily experience of a typical Bulgarian family trying to overcome the constant consumer deficits and obtain the basic necessities of life. Obviously, it is written by Despina Popova, who at that time was 38 years old. She worked as a librarian at the National Library in Sofia. I will not read the whole story. The limited product range available to the socialist consumer was not the only offense against the individual rights and liberties committed by the communist state. The control system empowered by the dominant communist ideology repressed individual choices in terms of restricting access to information, books, journals, and music, any channels for disseminating alternative lifestyles and ideologies. On that basis, intellectuals as well as representatives of music-related subcultures were persecuted by the authorities, who sought to eliminate any deviation from the officially approved behavior. Recently, subcultural identities repressed in the past have been examined by the representatives of the young generations of researchers at the Institute of Ethnology and Folklore Studies. Thus, Yana Yancheva published the paper with the title "The Rock Culture of the Small Town in the 1960s and the Early 1970s of the 20th Century." This paper was published in the Journal of the Institute, Bulgarian Ethnology, in 2012. Her analysis is based on the interviews she made with two adult male rock and roll fans, residents of a small provincial town in northwestern Bulgaria. In the same issue of Bulgarian Ethnology, Vihra Barova presented her research on the changing group identity of the youth westernized subcultures in Bulgaria. According to Barova, the identity is in fact formed by the contradiction between the old, before 1989, and the new understanding, after 1989, of the Western culture. Her paper, called "In the Family of the Different Subculture Identities, Styles, Ideologies, Prejudice," is based on a field work done in Plovdiv among the representatives of punk, skinhead and hardcore subcultures. My analysis of the memory studies in Bulgaria focused on the relationship between memory and identity. Therefore, I have shown how Bulgarian researchers address the notable potential of memories in the process of constructing collective identities among the representatives of communities and groups marginalized by the communist states, such as the Christian and Muslim and Bulgarian Muslim communities and the group of the former camp inmates in Bulgaria. The identity and gender politics of the communist state endorsed the unifying aspects of the socialist culture in opposition to Western-style alternatives exemplified by a diverse consumer culture and subculture-oriented lifestyles and identifications. Thank you for your attention.